We'll do a review in Likkutei Sichos in volume 21. This is the first Sicha for the portion of Vaeira. This is a Rashi Sicha, and it's a new rule that the Rebbe learns from this Rashi, which appears to be something totally new, how Rashi brings down the pshat and then brings down the medrash, and he rejects the medrash, and then he still brings it down, and then he says, well, there is different ways of interpretation, as he brings the pasuk like a hammer banging against the rock, and it splits to different sparks. And the Rebbe is going to show and look into the precise wording of Rashi and gonna come up with a new rule in Rashi's teaching, that sometimes Rashi wants you to know that even though it's a medrash, but the pshat tells you that there is a medrash, that you should be learning the medrash, because this is another important part of the learning. That's not, there's some sections that belong to the pshat, and there's some sections that belong to the medrash. Rashi brings the sections that belong to the pshat, and sometimes when he needs a medrash, but the medrash doesn't really fit in the pshat, he says there is a medrash. Go find it in the medrash. But in this case, and in cases like this, what Rashi is saying, that even the pshat tells you that you need to learn the medrash. Let's look inside and go step by step. It's a gewaldige insight into all the problems that the Rashi poses for us before we get to the Rebbe's insight and explanation. So let's take it step by step. Vaeira. So the first thing is, what is the pasuk Vaeira Lavram coming to tell us? In the previous parsha, Moshe Rabbeinu was complaining to Hashem about the condition that the Jewish people were put in, especially after Moshe Rabbeinu went in and on their behalf and pleaded with Paroi. He made it even worse, and he complains to Hashem, Lo Mareisa. Then Hashem is sort of angry with him, and he says, Atos Sira, now you will see. And this parsha follows. So in one level, it is the continuation of the previous complaint. That's the medrash, the second Pirush Rashi. In the Pashat, the first shot in Rashi, that this Hashem is saying to Avram, Vaeira Lavram, that I have promised Avram, Yitzchak, Yaakov to give to his children the land of Canaan, and now I'm going to fulfill it as the pasuk says. And the second shot, the medrash shot, is that this is a continuous of these rebukes. So Rashi brings down both of them, and Rashi says that the medrash doesn't fit, and he's learning like the pshat. Let's look inside. So in the beginning, in Ascholus Hasedr of Eila Lavrom, Begama Kemoises Brisi Itom, bringt Rashi Tzvei Perushim. Rashi brings two interpretations. Number one, Aleph, as der Teuchen von die Psukim, that the content of these verses is a Haggadome to the weiterdike Psukim. This is an introduction to the following verses. Later on, it says, the verse that follows, it says, V'gam ani shamaiti esnakas b'nei Yisrael goyim. And also, I've heard the cry out of the Bnei Yisrael under the servitude, the hardship of the Egyptians. So therefore, say to the Bnei Yisrael that Hashem is going to take them out. I will take you out. And as a Hagdama, Hashem said, I promised Avram Yitzchak Yaakov to take you out. V'bald that Eibishter hat maftiach given, since Hashem promised to the others, to our forefathers, und gemacht mit sie abris, and he made a covenant with them, loses lahem es Eretz Canaan, to give to them the Eretz Canaan. Vaeira lavrom vel Yitzchak vel Yaakov, loses, and the passage continues, loses lahem es Eretz Canaan. Un hat es noch nicht mekayim given. He has not yet fulfilled his promise. The Rebbe sagt der Eibishter, so that's why the Psukim say, "V'gam ani shomayti goimer," so that I heard the Esker is bris, I remember my covenant l'chein. I'm going to say unervet it's mekayim zayin davtochas, and now he's going to fulfill the promises. That's one way of learning that this is an introduction. Vaeira Avram Yitzchak vel Yaakov. Since I promised them, and now I'm going to fulfill my promise. Then there is a pshat that it follows the previous parsha. Base, but Abeseinu Darshu Linyan Shel Milo. Our Rebbes, our teachers, expounded it that it continues the topic of above. Shomar Moshe Lo Mahare Yoso. Moshe says, "How come you did bad?" As the psukim batziin sich zum friedlichen Inyan. That these verses are related, they follow the previous subject. Und seinen an Entweder Amiras Moshe, they are sort of a response to Moshe's saying, Lo Ma'areisa. Moshe said, why did you do bad? This pasuk by Daber, by Vaeira Lavrom, is a response. They bring in They bring out, express the advantage, the greatness of the forefathers. Lo yomru li mashmecha. They didn't see what is. They didn't say what's your name. V'lo hirharu achar midoisai, and they did not question. They did not have any thoughts after how my measure, what I'm dealing. They didn't challenge me. They didn't question Hashem. Mashenkin Moshe, but you Moshe, Vaeira Lavrom Tzov Yaakov, Bushmebai Loinito Daitelahem. Mashenkin Moshe, but you Moshe, Va'ato Marto, you say Mashmoi. You say, what's his name? You say Lo Marioiso. So this is Hashem continuing to rebuke Moshe for his questioning and for complaining to Hashem, Lo Mahariyesa. That's the pshat that Rashi brings from the Medrash. Well, Rashi is mamshich noch bringen dem zweiten Pirush. Rashi continues after he brings the second interpretation. Ve'edin haMedrash misyashiv achar hamikra mipnei kama dvorim. This expounding commentary of the Medrash does not sit well in the pasuk, in the verse, mipnei kama dvorim, for several reasons. And Rashi brings down frag derif zwei shailas. He has two questions. Und is the noch Messiah, and that's what. And Rashi concludes. Lakach ani oimer. So Rashi is saying, therefore I say, Yisyashim hamikra al pshutei dover dibur alefanav. Let the verse be settled, interpreted in the literal way, every item on its place that fits it. And the expounding, let it be expounded. And that's okay, Shenemar, because the pasuk says, Haloi koi dvorai koish. For is then my word not like fire? Num Hashem, says God. It's like a hammer that breaks up a rock. It divides into many sparks. What is Rashi's addition over here that about the Medrash? He wants to say, almost seems like a Pashtus is trying to say, although it's not the Pshat, but it's still legitimate, it's still authentic, it's still okay. But Pashtus zet ois, it seems simply, as Rashi is the oisun zu zogen, but Rashi is trying to tell you that as Aleph, as loiterach pshat. So first Rashi is telling you that this doesn't fit in pshat, but yet it's okay. As loiterach pshat ken men nit einlernen den pirush hamedrash, according to the path of the simple interpretation of the verse, you cannot interpret the interpretation of the medrash. While it is nit misyashiv achar hamikra, it doesn't fit into the pasuk. Und Rashi zog doch haklal b'harbe mekoymes. Rashi is given out the rule in many places as anile basi elul pshuto shel mikra, that I'm here just for the simple meaning of the verse. And the only time he brings the medrash when they bring nor anagoda meyashev is divra mikra, he only brings an agoda that will settle the words of the pasuk. Davar dibur alifanov, so each matter would be properly, but not if the medrash doesn't fit. In this case, eina medrash misyashiv al hamikra. We can't. This medrash doesn't fit. But base, and then Rashi is also trying to tell you leidach gisa. On the other hand, but Rashi cautions as das meint nicht, as der Pirush HaMedrash hat bechlal chas v'sholem kin ordnit in Pirush HaTorah. This does not mean to say that the interpretation of the Medrash does, God forbid, not have at all any room in as an interpretation, as a commentary on interpretation of the Torah. Nor v'hadrasha tidorish, that they be expounded. Since the words of Torah divide in various different styles of learning, like the hammer that breaks up the rock, and according to the style of the drash is adrabe, hadorish tidorish. According to the drash, let the drasha be expounded in the drasha way. That's what it seems like Rashi is saying over here. His base, the Rebbe continues that we really can't say as simple as it seems like that he doesn't it doesn't fit the pshat, and the adrash is still okay, because Rashi has already brought down Medrashim many times in the Chumash. And if Rashi has a comment like this, that the Medrash doesn't fit, and Kipetish, that it's authentic, that it's okay, why doesn't it say it over there? Gimel, base. If he says over Tumua, according to this, it's surprising if this is what Rashi is saying. Aleph. Sie ist nicht der Derech HaRogel von Rashi zu herabringen Pirushim und noch sei aufregen. That's not usual. It's unusual for Rashi to bring down a commentary and then to challenge it and say that it's not fitting. Nor sagt melechatchila dem Pirush Hamasim l'pshat hamikra. To begin with, Rashi says the proper interpretation that is fitting to the simple meaning of the pasuk. It doesn't say it and challenges it, the other one. Und da is Rashi meitig dem Pirush von Rabbi Seinu uba'arichas. He quotes the commentary of our teachers of the Medrash, and at great length. Und gleich noch dem, and immediately afterwards, fragt es up, he challenges it. Weil is nicht misyashev achar mikra, because it doesn't fit in the pasuk. In Rashi, it's not Rashi's style to bring down and then show the challenge. Rashi just brings the pshat in the beginning. Something else is over here. This is not just another pshat. And Beis, and if Rashi, it's necessary to say that even if it's not pshat, it's okay. Rashi should have said it earlier. Beis, Rashi, darf bavornen. If Rashi needs to caution. As when men can it on that even when you are not able to accept in this style of pshat a commentary from the Medrash, And Rashi needs to tell us, is this Obera Pirush Amiti in Torah? It's still a true interpretation in Torah. And the reason is, Val Divre Torah Zainen Kipatish Yifetzitz Sela. Because the words of Torah are like a hammer that breaks up the Sela, the rock. Hot doch es Rashi gedacht bavornen. So Rashi should have cautioned us, told us about this, dort, where Zoktam Ersten Mol, where he says the first time, as bringt nicht bepirushe agodis, that he does not bring in his commentary on the Chumash, he does not quote, he does not bring down the agodis, which don't settle the verses, the words of the pasuk. But this is in Parashas Bereshis, back in Parashas Bereshis. I should have said there that those medrashim that are okay because there's other medrashim, but Rashi doesn't need to say that because almost it seems that it's obvious. Befrat as Rashi is dort mevair kamo protim wegen di medrashim. Rashi over there gives a various details with regards to medrashim. He says, "Yesh medrash agod rabbi." There are many agodas medrashim. Ukvar sidrun Rabbi Seinu al mechoinom. Our teachers have organized them properly. Bebreshis Rabo, and that's in the Medrash Rabo, Bishar Medrashis, and the other medrashim. But I have only come forth here to the simple meaning of the verse, and also and for an agoda that settles the words of the pasuk, davar dibra of each matter on its way, and similar to what Rashi says here. So when Rashi talks about medrashim in the Parshas Bereshis, so Rashi should have said over there, Rashi should have immediately there explain Zayin Reid, his words, Zayin should have concluded like here. Vadrosha to Dorish, let the expounding be expounded. Shenemar, my word is like fire, can be divided into many sparks. Why doesn't Rashi say it over there? Over here, we have to say that there's something different and more that Rashi wants over here, as the Rebbe is going to explain. So the Rebbe basically says this is unusual for Rashi to bring down a commentary and then challenge it. He just tells you straight what the right interpretation is. And it's also not understood why would Rashi have to tell us that the other commentaries are okay, because they're also a good pirush. He should have said that long ago if that's necessary. And Rashi discusses about medrashim earlier on, and he should have said over there that it's okay because kipat shifetz etzela, like it say over here. So now, what is the problem in these psukim that Rashi needs the medrash b'chlal to explain? Because, as we'll see, that in the very first opening of the portion of Vaeira, it says Vaidaber, which is a language of harsh talk. So if it's just merely a introduction to what's coming, so the Vaidaber doesn't fit in, so Rashi sort of has to explain how this Vaidaber fits. Let's look inside. Gimel. The Pashtus Lerutman, simply we learn as Rashi bring them pirush for Rabbi Seinu. The reason Rashi brings the commentary of our teachers, the far, by Leut dem pirush werden verentfert kamo shailes was me ken fragen Leut nerst dem pirush. Several questions are answered that one can ask according to the first pirush al pipshute. The simple meaning, the first commentary, Shat, has difficulties. And with this second one, you can answer them. If the Verta Vaidaber Elikim al Moshe Shebetchilas HaSedra, on the words Elikim spoke, says Dibur to Moshe B'Tchilas HaSedra, is Rashi Mefarish. Rashi explains Diber Itoy Mishpat. Hashem talked with Moshe Mishpat judgment, tough. Since he was hard to speak and to say, why did you do bad to this people? So Hashem is responding with Vaidaber, with the strong words. Una Yosef is a them Peter Zoknit Rashi. Rashi doesn't say on that Vaidaber that this is kosher, but Abesenu Dorshuk Yotzbe that this is expounded by our rabbis. Is so it's evident the simple meaning of the pasuk. So the first words of the pasuk by Daber that he speaks, that he spoke to him tough, is also according to the pshat. This is not the medrash. Kumtlif is a oy, so it turns out according to this. As Leuten ersten Pirish Hanal in Rashi, according to the first pshat in Rashi, that as the Amira Vayomer Elov Goimer Vaeira, that one follows by Daber, and he says to him, "Is nita hemshich tzulama hariyosa." So when it says that's not that's all of that is just an introduction for later. Nor ahagdoma tzuvagama nishumaiti luchena mergoimer. This is all after this kosher, the dibur kosher, when Hashem says to him, Vaeira Lavrom El Yitzchok, and that is to fulfill the promise. And therefore, Gamanisha Maiti, adds an introduction to the following. So we have like a split in the meaning of the pasuk. The first 4 words, Vaidaber Elikim El Moshe, and in the 4 Wörter, Vaidaber Elikim El Moshe, those are Aniim Ifnei Atzmai. They are, Hashem spoke to Moshe means he was tough with Moshe. And immediately it goes over to Vayomer Elov. That follows what the previous parsha Hashem said. He said to the Eibishter Lomar Eiso. Hashem answers him tough. By Dabere love, by Dabere Likim El Moshe speaks back with tough to him for him speaking tough to Hashem. So this is a continuation Lomar Eiso. And then later on, Vayomer, I love Vaeira. He's coming to tell him that he heard the argument, and therefore he is going to take a step. That's why this is very difficult. This is, however, to learn like this, the pasuk is not very smooth. Make this interruption like this, vile. Because in addition, the Rebbe says in the brackets, in addition, that now you're splitting this verse. You used to split this verse into 2, 1 verse into 2. The beginning of the pasuk, to the parsha lifnei. That comes as a follow-up to the portion beforehand. Fundi Werter in zweiten Hälfte pasuk, and the words from the second part of the verse. Vayomer Elov Anei Hashem, from that point and on, was is the haschola from the Vaita Dikamira, which is the beginning of what Hashem says. Vaeira, I appeared. So from that part of the pasuk, starts a new subject. So we're splitting the pasuk into the past and in the future. So besides that, there's another issue, is gleich noch shailas Moshe. Immediately in the previous parsha in Shmois, after Moshe says to Hashem, questions Hashem, why did you do bad? Steht an answer from Eibishter. So over there's an answer from Hashem. Now you will see. Heint. Parvosol the Torah uptailing. So why would the Eibishter was already talking to him, tell him now you will see. So why should the Torah separate blois 4 Wörter, just for 4 words by Daber Elikim El Moshe? For them afraid they can answer from the previous answer. Und sie reinstellen in a besonder Parsha in a besonder Posik, put it into a separate portion and in a separate part, in a separate Sedra. Should have continued over there. Atosira Vaidaber Elikim El Moshe, that he was talking to him tough. And the Riber brings Rashi then Pirush for Rabbi Seinu, and that's where Rashi brings the commentary of our teachers. Was loit them Pirush, according to that meaning, Zainen Dip Sukim Vaeira Goimer. The whole flow of these verses, this is all continuing that Vaidaber Elikim El Moshe, and this is Eirel Avram, are part of the Dibur Kosher that Hashem spoke to Moshe. Those einen the divrei mishpat. These are the words of judgment, of tough words. Was the Eibishter hat gesagt Moshe that Hashem said Moshe al shehiksha ledaber v'loimar lomar eisa, because he was tough and said to the Eibishter, why did you do bad? So this would all be flow. So that is what it seems like the problem would be with the pshat, and we need it for the pshat. That would be the problem would be with the drash, because we're splitting up the pasuk. But the Rebbe says that's not what Rashi says. Rashi says that he has the problem with the drash because of the two questions that he has, that it's not misyashiv, not because we're splitting the pasuk in the middle, or because this pasuk was not supposed to have a separate pasuk. You should have just stayed all in the parsha Shmois. Rashi has another problem, so that's not the problem. So why do we need the medrash altogether? Dalet, aber kadaikis kemen azoy nit answer. But when you really look in, you cannot answer so. But Rashi is talking clear, because Rashi states very clearly, this medrash does not settle by the pasuk for various matters. This haste, which means as the Schwierigkeit in the Pirush seinen Fila, that there is many difficulties in this commentary, and they are so big, as we can ganzen nicht annehmen den Pirush Leuten derech Pshat, we cannot at all accept it according to the Pshat. The Shaila is impossible, even though it might answer a question or some questions in the pasuk. So basically, it's not that this medrash, this pirush, can somewhat answer us or give us a little bit of explanation. And Memele, Rashi brings it down also as a possibility to answer something. No, Rashi says beferish that it doesn't answer at all. It's totally not pshat. Well, if it's totally not pshat, so why bring it down and challenge it? So since that's the case, so the question comes back to its place. Why is Rashi at all quote and at length the Pirush for Rabbi Seinu from the interpretation of Rabbi Zubal the Nemtinitoni does not accept it? If the interpretation of Rabbi Seinu would have answered a little bit, because we have a problem in the pasuk according to the pshat, and it answers a little bit, then Rashi brings it down because it gives us some relief from the question that we have. But since Rashi says it does not fit at all, so what's the point of bringing down a Pirush and challenging it? Warum afilu in the Erter wo Rashi will nor onmerkun as in Medrash is varan a Pirush, because even in places where Rashi just wants to make a point that in the Medrash there's an interpretation was for entfert akasha was that would answer a question that would come according to the simple meaning of the pasuk. No, Rashi nem dem Pirush nicht derech Pshat. It's only that Rashi does not accept it in the style of Pshat. Rashi, if you just want to hint to a problem, is that derech from Rashi to zogon bekitza. So Rashi's style is to say in short, yesh medrash agodarab. There's many agodic interpretation, or similar to that. Wie man gefindt, the Pirush Rashi become Mekaymis, like we find in Rashi's commentary in many places. It is ober nit meitig the Medrash. Rashi does not quote the Medrash. Why does Rashi quote the Medrash over here? And then challenges it over here. If Rashi wants to say a Medrash, in this case, it would answer the split of the pasuk, but Rashi doesn't have to bring down the whole Medrash that doesn't really fit. So this is the question, Bechlal, bringing the Medrash. Now the Rebbe is going to specifically address Rashi's point, the way Rashi writes it over here, that there's different ways, there's different Medrashim. It's like a stone that breaks the rock, and Rashi is going to show that this Rashi is different than what Rashi says elsewhere. Rashi also brings this pasuk, as the Rebbe explains in Oisei. In the Msim Anal from the Rashi, in the end of the Rashi, the above Rashi, Rashi says, "Va'adrosha tidorish." Let the drosha be expounded. Shenamar, the pasuk says, "Haloi koidvorei ka'esh neum Hashem." Hashem says, "My words are like fire and ukipatish, and like a hammer. Yefaitzet sela, that splits up, breaks up the stone. Mischalik lekamon, it spreads into many sparks." And when we'll pay attention to the exact language Rashi, we'll see that Rashi actually, on the surface, it's not understood what Rashi is saying here, but what Rashi is really saying is going to give us a clue to understand what this whole Pirush is doing over here. So these words, Fader Tzich, they require explanation. What does it mean that it splits into several sparks? What splits? The rock splits? The hammer splits? They don't split. They split into pieces, into little particles, but not sparks. On these words, I said it splits into sparks. There's a give and take. There's a discussion in the commentators. What is the item that is being split? One pirush is as dos batzitzach tum sela. This refers. It talks about the rock. Like a rock that is being broken up by the hammer that breaks up the rock. The rock becomes crumbed up by the hammer. That's how Rashi interprets it in his commentary of the Gemara in Tractate Shabbos. It's just like a hammer. The rock splits through it to many different sparks. So that the sparks here that we're talking about is the pieces, the crumbs, part of the rock. That's one interpretation. Another interpretation is that das meint them patish. That means the hammer splits into parts. Others have that version in Rashi, the Loshna Gemara, as the Gemara's language is mapatish zem ischalek. The hammer splits. Hulu. We're talking about a very strong stone. That will break and split the hammer. That's the meaning of it. And a third interpretation is as those batzitzir zum patish. It's talking about the hammer. The hammer splits, but das meint nicht, dass der patish gufa wird nischalek lechalachim. It doesn't mean that the hammer itself becomes split into pieces, nor as durch hakos hapatish ifensela, but rather through the banging of the hammer on the rock, gain from patish arish netzoytzes from this hammer, sparks of fire come out. So the Rebbe says each one really, and the Rebbe is going to give a different pirush altogether. It's going to explain everything beautifully, but the Rebbe is going to bring out that each one of these interpretations really has a difficulty. In each one of these commentaries, seemingly there's a difficulty. In the Ersten Pirush, in the first interpretation, it's not understood. We're talking about the rock being split up, and the Rashi in the Gemara is not understood like the Ramas. Since it's the rock that is being split, is favos nutzt Rashi dem loshun nitzoitzes. So why does Rashi say that nitzoitzes, there's no sparks here, there's particles of the rock? Vos past mer if adover ameir. It's more fitting to say the sparks, something that shines. Unidem loshun mitzchalik l'kama chalokim. And Rashi does not use it divides into many pieces instead of saying it divides into many sparks. Sparks is by something that shines, not by a rock. A rock should be into many pieces. So that's a little difficult to explain Rashi like that. If Rashi meant the rock being split up, he would use the Lashon Kama Chalokim, not sparks. The zweite Pirush is in ganze nicht verstandig al derech Pshat. The second interpretation is totally not understood in the style of Pshat. In addition, that the question of Rabbi Yoel Mizrahi also applies there, is or not, if we're breaking up the hammer, the patish should also not say sparks, it should say, but in addition to that, Aleph says, this goes against, it's opposite of the simple meaning to Taichin, that kipatish ifeitzet that a hammer that splits the rock, we're saying that the rock splits the hammer. As the patish vet nispeitzet durch dem Sela, that the hammer becomes broken up through the rock. Befrat loit unser Girse in Pirush Rashi, especially in our version in Rashi, as steht nicht der Werte ma patish zeh, that just this patish mischalek chulu. So there's no wording, there's no indication that we're talking about splitting a patish. Hodach gorke ort nicht zu sagen, as Rashi doesn't really make any, there's no room to explain that Rashi wants to say, and Rashi always goes literally, meaning he wants to be clarity. So Rashi means here, so Rashi writes it not clearly that the patish stam, it just brings down like a hammer that breaks up the rock, and he means and he should mean that it's the hammer that's breaking up on base. Meaning them heipach hapshat them sela, not the pathogen to means against the simple meaning that it means the sela, but it means the patish. It doesn't say anything, and he's also saying that it goes the sparks when it really means the hammer. So that's not really fitting. One, and number two, for that ability for a rock to be able to split the hammer, it has to be a very hard rock. Rashi should have said that. Rashi should have specified and clarified. As here we're talking about the retzavek asala kosher. We're talking about a hard, difficult sela. Was durch ihn wird nispeitzet der patish, through the hardship, the hard of the sela, the hammer is split. Nit v'agavei sela was adrabe. The patish is imitates. It's not like a usual rock, which on the contrary, there the hammer splits the rock. Oich. The dritter pirush is not moving. Also, the third interpretation is not understood. That we're talking about the sparks are split. The sparks that come from the banging of the hammer onto the rock is not understood. Besides what we just said before, that literally you can't ask kipatish yifaitzitzela. As yifaitzitzela gate oisela. Because the third interpretation was that actually the patish is the one that is bringing banged up, but it's not that the hammer itself is being broken, but there are sparks coming out of the hammer. But it still has the idea, so that we have the problem, the word, the pashta taich of kipatish yifaitzitzela is that the hammer breaks the rock on the sela, not that the sela breaks the patish or causes the patish sparks to come from the patish. So besides that, pastus haloshim is chalik lekama nitzoytz. When you say it splits into different sparks, it's not that sparks fly from it, but it is split into sparks. Is as the zach wird is chalik, the item becomes split. Und nicht as von ihr gehen a reise beäufung von es chalik nitzutz, is not that from it come out and it splits into spark. So over here, the Rebbe says the bottom line is all these different ways of explaining it. Is it the rock that is being split? Is it that the stone is being split, or is it the stone that is being the hammer that is being split in the sparks that come out of it? The bottom line is Rashi should say clearly what he means and not leaving it in a, that's the big surprise, in a unclear comment without clarifying it, which is the opposite. But Rashi is a clarification on the simple level to make things clear. From them, from all this, we come to the greatest surprise in all this. Since Rashi has written his commentary in a very clear language, which needs to be understood even for a 5-year-old as learning Chumash. How come in our case he's writing this matter in such a closed way, which leaves room for a debate, and many interpretations, Rashi and Rashi's intention. And the Tmir wird noch starker. The surprise is even greater. Since even in his commentary on the Gemara, Taich Rashi up Klor Zain Pirush, the Maimer Chazal Zeh, Rashi very clearly translates his meaning in this saying of the sages. As thus made Mischale Kasela Kenal Rashi brought down before from Rashi, that we're really talking is about splitting the stone. And this is even in the Gemara. Rashi needs to clarify this. Is the halachas kama v'kama azeret hazegit hafton b'pirush al HaTorah. So how much more so? Rashi should have clarified in the pirush al HaTorah. There must be something easier and more clear to understand, as the Rebbe will continue to explain after asking another question in the Rashi, that Rashi brings down also the beginning of the pasuk, which will be the key to the Rebbe's solution, as we'll see further in Oisvav. Oisvav. Nocha diuk in the Mloshe Rashi Hanal. Another point and question in the Rashi's language that we brought down. B'shas Rashi bring them posik ukepatish yifoitzitzela. When Rashi brings the verse like a hammer that splits the rock, is that thereby maitik oich tchilas hakosuf. Rashi quotes also the beginning of the verse. Haloi koi dvorei ka'esh neum Hashem. is then my word not like fire, says Hashem. Isn't it move on? It's not understood. What are these opening words, the beginning words to the Minyan was Rashi will bringen, to the subject matter that Rashi is trying to bring out? As in ein posik and zayin merer pirushim, that in one verse there can be several interpretations. L'chayre, it would seem, is to them inyan ageya belois their moshul shabesim akosher. For that matter, what's important is only the moshul, the parable in the end of the pasuk, ukipati shifaitzit sela, like the hammer that splits the rock. Why does he bring down also the beginning of the pasuk aloi koid varikaish? The Tmi Bazay is not aggressive, the surprise is even greater. When you compare it to the sources over there, Taka does not bring down the opening of the verses. Other Inyan, as for the Apostle is this idea that's from this verse we learn out, that just like a hammer splits into many sparks, so one aspect of Torah can be split into many pieces. We find it in Tractate Shabbos and Tractate Sanhedrin. In Mesechta Shabbos lernt man davon up. In Tractate Shabbos we learn from this as Kol Dibur v'Dibur sheyotze mepi HaKadosh Baruch Hu nechalak l'shivim l'shonos, that every saying and saying that came from HaKadosh Baruch Hu was split into 70 languages. And that's comes from this, that's we learn from the Pasuk. Kapatu shifetz etzela. When in Masechta Sanhedrin, and in Masechta Sanhedrin we say, as mikra echad yetzer the kamatayim, that one Pasuk can have different reasonings. So in Shabbos we learn from it that it was interpreted in 70 languages, and over there we learned that it was one Pasuk and could have several reasons. Und in Breda Erta bringt sich Take nit as Cholas HaKosov. Take doesn't bring there the opening of the verse Alei Koid Varekesh Num Hashem. Nor blows the Werter Kipati Shifetz Etzela, because only the words like the hammer that breaks the rock, because that's the only important part. Now, although the Rebbe says, so basically we see that when it's trying to tell you there's various reasons from one pasuk or the various translation, it doesn't bring down the beginning pasuk. That's not part of this parable. Over there is kipat shifayt tzela. That's the main point. However, the Rebbe says in the other Gemaras where it is brought down, because over there the koid varakeish is, the Rebbe says like this: in Masechta Sukkah, Masechta Kedushin, in the Tractate Sukkah, Tractate Kedushin, bringt sich der Maimer. Over there we bring the statement, in Pogabach menuvel zeh moshchei lebeis hamedrash. If this menuvel, the Yetzer Hara, bumps into you, draw him into the study hall. And it says, in Barzel hu mispoitzitz. If he is as strong as metal, this menuvel, the Yetzer Hara, he will be scattered. So over there it says, because my word is like fire, says Hashem, and like a patish, like a hammer that breaks a cellar. But dort is verstandig. But over there we understand why it starts, brings down the opening of the verse. Why do we say that if you pull him to the Meis HaMedrash, you're going to impact? As im barzel hu mispeitzitz. If he's like metal, he will break up. His Kipirish Rashi dort. Rashi explains, why will it? Sha'at Torah ka'esh nimshala hamifa'afeya es habarzel. Torah is considered like fire that can float away the metal. So basically, the fire part is important, essential. The melee is dirt. Negeo muchach to wissen over there. It's important, and we have to know as the Torah is angeglichen to eish, because it's the fire part over there that can dissolve the metal. Halekoid varakaish. But in our case, like in the Gemara's bringing down over there, it doesn't say anything. Is l'chayrin ganze nit negeas cholas hakosov, the beginning of the pasuk isn't seem important. And the Rebbe knows Zion says further, even Rashi brings down this pasuk elsewhere, and also it doesn't start over there with alekoid varekayesh. Zion, the Tmiyas Ha'amuris in Sif Hey and Vav. These above surprises about bringing down Halekoid Vore Kaesh, Verenoch Kereser, and the other part that the Rebbe brought down in the the questioning this pasuk over here that the Rebbe brought down. When you compare this to the way Rashi translates himself earlier in the pasuk. Shasman vergleicht the Tmis Hamuris if hey Vav ver noch größer, they become even greater. Shasman vergleicht them Pirush Rashi when you compare this commentary of Rashi with Zayim Aferir, they compare it with a previous commentary in Parshas Vayishlach, in the portion of Vayishlach. From Pasuk Vayikra Loi Kel Elokei Yisrael says he called him. So, is this Moshe calling Hashem Kel Elokei Yisrael, or is it God calling Yaakov Kel Elokei Yisrael? That Yaakov is the Kel Elokei Yisrael. Zokt Rashi tzei pirush. Einem al derech hapshat, one is simple, unoch hapirush v'as Rabbi Seinu Dorshu, and another interpretation that our teachers expounded, one is Messiah. And he concludes, "V'divrei Torah kipatish yifaiset salah." The words of Torah is like a hammer that breaks up a rock. Mischalkim l'kamatayim can be divided up to various reasoning. V'ani liyashib shutei shel mikrobasi. I've just come to answer to settle the simple meaning of the pasuk. Is the Rashi medayik zu sagen the minyan ba'ifim barer pasuk. So here Rashi is precise and makes sure to say this idea in a very clear and simple way. Aleph, that is Misayim, he concludes Mischalik Lekamatimim, divides into various reasoning. It doesn't say no sparks, no nitzutzes, Mischalik Kamatimim. Was Batzitzach Divrei Torah. This refers to words of Torah. Umizeh, and from this we know as the taich in the moshul. So what is how do we translate the moshul when it says kipatish yifeitzitzalah? Is kipashtus aloshin. It's like the simple language that you're breaking up the rocks is broken up into different meanings, different pieces. Rashi does not need to translate it as the patish sabrekel themselves kamachalokim, that the hammer breaks up the rock for various pieces and base, and also Rashi bring nitchilos hakosov. Rashi doesn't bring the beginning of the pasuk like Hashem, that my word is like fire, says Hashem. Nor blows the verter kipatish yifeitzitzalah. It just brings like the hammer that breaks the rock. Ver doch noch mer tomu Rashi beparshas seinu. So it becomes even more surprising in Rashi in our parsha. Halamai is Rashi mishana from Pirushi beparsha vayishlach. What is the reason that Rashi would change his interpretation than what he already explained the portion of Ishlach? Un Aleph, how does he change it? Number one, Zok mischalik l'kama nitzotzos. He says it splits into various sparks. Das heißt, Rashi is noch mamshich zu reden in Moshel. He continues to give you the example of what's happening up with the splitting. It's not yet talking about the schal timing like in Vayishlach, where he's talking already about the nimshal, about the Torah. Where here we're talking about the moshel, still we're talking about the rock, or the patish, or the netzotzes, unzvert and ribenit klor, and therefore it's not clear what is the davar hamischalik, which is the one that is being split. A base, is Moisiv as Cholos HaKosuv Alei Koidvora Ka'esh Nom Hashem. He adds the beginning of the verse, Koidvora Ka'esh Nom Hashem, which he doesn't have over there. So how do we make sense of all this? In Ois Ches, the Rebbe begins to explain, and he says that when we look at the comparison of these two Rashis, we'll actually get the clue what's going on and why is it different, and that Rashi here is actually intending to say something different. And the Rebbe will bring out that Rashi is coming up with a new idea, which sometimes why we bring down the Medrash, which is different than what we learned before. Let's look inside. First, to see how these changes in the Rashis give us a clue in what Rashi means. Yes. The beer in them, the explanation of this, as ein shinui verantwortet dem zweiten. One change in Rashi answers why we have the other change in Rashi. Durch die zwei Shinuyim bepirushei do legabe pirushei beparshas Vayishlach. Through the two differences in his commentary here versus Rashi's commentary in Parshas Vayishlach. What are the two differences? Aleph, over here, Moisiv Zayin, Rashi adds the B'chilas HaKosuv, Haloi Koi Dvora Ka'esh. Over here, Rashi adds the Pasik, behold, my word is like fire. Unbeis. And number two, Mistayik Zayin. He says here clearly, Mischalik L'kama Nitzoytzoyz, that it's divides into many sparks, as opposed to many pieces of the patish. Macht Rashi klor sein kavona. So Rashi is clarifying what his intention is. As der mischalik bepirush Rashi zeh, that what does it mean splits? What Rashi is talking about over here, batzitzich oifun vort eish. That's on the word the fire. The fire, the dvorai ka eish, is that is splitting up, Shebetchilas HaKosuv, which is in the beginning of the quote from the Pasuk. Was this Pashut, we know, and especially when you go in the simpler, as not Eish, that only fire, or need patish v'sela, not a hammer and not a stone, are split into sparks. So what is that which is split into the tzotzes? That is Eish, because Eish is what is split. That's what Rashi is saying here. The Eish is split into many parts, many sparks. Und der Pirush is vipashtus masmois laoshun Rashi. What is the meaning is as the meaning and the simple meaning of Rashi. Behold, my word is like fire, which means the Ivrei Torah seinen geglichen ze'esh, that the words of Torah are compared to fire. Neum Hashem, says Hashem. Ukefatish yefeitzitz sela, and like a hammer, geglichen zapatish welcher yefeitzitz sela breaks up a rock. Just as he hammer breaks up a rock into many pieces, crumbs, azoy is der eish, koidvoreka eish, was menet wegen em do divrei Torah. So the fire, which is the topic of discussion over here, the eish is also broken up to common mischalik, the common nitzotzes, is divided into many sparks. Und der Tam favos Rashi is no mishane from Pirushim beParshas Vayishlach. Why are we changing the splitting? We're saying that there is a splitting of sparks, rather than saying there's a splitting of the stone, the sela. Where nutz the moshel patish yefeitzet selek shel atzmei, doesn't bring down the beginning of the pasuk of the eish. He just brings like a hammer breaks up the stone on its own without saying the Aish and the sparks, Kinal, is Valdo is the Achidush, because there is a novelty in the Oifun HaKesher v'Hayachas, the connection and the relationship zwischen Medrashay und Peshutay, the Medrash and the Pshut. There's a relationship here. Was the Pasik Dugma Deroif, the fitting example on that relationship is Davke von Ischalkus Ha'esh L'Kama Netzitzis. It's specifically from the fire being split up to several sparks, Kidil L'Kamon, as the Rebbe is going to explain. Now, the Rebbe is going to explain, when we try to say that the pshat is the pshat, Rashi is not really coming to say, well, the medrash is authentic as well, because that's obvious. Rashi is trying to tell us that sometimes there is a droshe, but the droshe is not al derech pshat. The pshat from them was Rashi zogt. What is the meaning when Rashi says, therefore, I say, let the verse be settled according to Pshat. Vadrosha to Dorish, and let the Dashin be Drosha. What is Rashi trying to say over here? It's not as you would learn superficially, as Rashi comes close in heaven, that Rashi is coming to teach us over here, to let us know as the drash is on Inyan Amiti in Torah, that the drash is the true aspect, a matter in Torah, like Derech Hadrash, according to the Derech Hadrash. That's not what Rashi is telling. The Michael Mashmalon, why is this? This doesn't need to tell us. What is he coming to teach us here? No, the Pshat, therefore, is, but what is the meaning? That Pshutay from the Mikro Do, the simple meaning of the pasuk is here. Mont demands, that the pshat demands, as zayin v'hadrosha tidorish. Let the drosha be expounded. So what does it mean? The pshat is telling you the drosha tidorish. Al derech hain al derech v'Rashi zog bekama mekoymes. Similar as Rashi says in many places. As ein hamikra ze oimer el dafsheni. This pasuk is telling us, you need to expound me. Nor mitachilik ikri. But there's a difference between adrosha to dorish and here el dafsheni. In jene erter kemen leuten derech hapshat in ganzen nit miyashiv sein divra hamikra. In those places where Rashi says ein hamikra ze oimer dafsheni means that in derech hapshat we are not able to answer the words of the pasuk at all, and therefore ein hamikra ze oimer al darsheni. So this pasuk says no, we have to make a drush over here. That iker pirush hamikra is like drash. The main meaning of the pasuk is according to the drash. But these are all ideas which either you can do it according to Pshat, or the Pshat tells you that you got to do it according to the Drosha. But in our pasuk, there's a new idea. In unser pasuk, Dr. Abarashi, anayun oifim bepirush hamikra, a new way in explaining the pasuk. Up till this point, we didn't have that new interpretation. As afal piyaz der mikro hota pirush b'derech hapshat. That not, although that this pasuk has a explanation in the pshat, unochmer, and furthermore, not only does it have an explanation that pirush is that iker erster pirush, that interpretation is the main, is the first pirush. Hayois as davke edis miyashiva mikra dover dibur alefanam. That's the only way to explain the pasuk, every piece that it fits in properly. Von deswegen, and yet zok, which means mont der pshat gufa, the simple text also tells you, demands, as vadrosha to dorosh, that the drosha should be expounded. Men muz onkommen zu dem drash, we have to come on to this drosha. Das heißt, this means as der pshat gufe is machriach, that the simple meaning itself forces us out as the posik and halt in zich, that this verse contains in itself side and pirush haposhut, both the simple meaning, uside and pirush from vahadrosha to dorish, and also the meaning that let the expounded drosha be expounded. That's part of the pshat tells you that. Umahai time is Rashi mighty the medrash, and that's where Rashi quotes the medrash. He says the message doesn't fit the pasuk. So if Rashi just wants to slug him up, the Rebbe asked before, Rashi should say the right pshat. But Rashi still quotes this medrash. While in them foul, because in this case, bleibt Rashi lemaskona, Rashi remains even in conclusion, euch mit medrash, notwithstanding the fact that it's not misyashiv, but yet he remains with that in conclusion, euch mit medrash. It should be expounded. How does that work? Yud, they're being them. Explanations. In the andere Erte, wo Rashi sagt, yesh medrash agoda rabbi mukiyoytze boy, when Rashi says there are other many agodic expansion or similar to that, but there meant Rashi to ondait. Rashi means to point out. Kinalsiv gimel as loit pshute shel mikra bleibt a schwerigkeit, that according to the simple meaning of the pasuk remains something difficult. Was wird verantwortet leuten medrash v'drash, which is answered according to the medrash and the drash. Is oised dem schwerigkeit in loshen hamikra, but besides the difficulty that we have in pshute shel mikra, in the language, there is no evidence, there's no proof, there's nothing that forces us, the pasuk, to go by the drash. The only reason there is a drash, that Rashi implies and indicates there's a drash to tell you that there is some difficulty remaining according to the pshat, but yet that's drash. But the pasuk itself doesn't fit in with the drash. Baldas, das is a medrash, was is klal nit meyashiv divra hamikra diver dibor alefanov. Since it's such a medrash which at all does not settle the words of the pasuk, each word in the proper way, und es verantwortet nit mehr wie die einzige Schwierigkeit in Loshen HaMikra, and it just answers just one difficulty in the language of the pasuk, which the medrash answers. Nemt Rashi nit on the medrash als pshuto shel mikra. Rashi does not accept that medrash is in the simple meaning of the pasuk. Rashi will tell you there is a medrash, we have a difficulty, and we answer there, but the medrash itself is not something which fits in the pshat. But in our case is nois of der tzu. So in addition to the fact that this was the pirush for Rabbi Seinu, the interpretation of our teachers for enter the shailas in Loshen HaMikra, answers the question, the language of the pasuk was very nit for enter like Ershton pirush, which are not answered according to the first pirush, as Kinal Sham, as we said earlier over there, that the pasuk is split up. By starts up with by daber dibur kosher, all these difficulty is that toichen Hapirish from Medrash and Inyan versus Mucharach Balavoch. The content, the idea that the Medrash represents is something which is, besides the Medrash, it's on its own, it's evident. Based on the contents of these Psukim, we know that it is on its own. When a 5-year-old learning Chumash learns Amidas, Moshe, that Moshe said, Lo maharei, so how come you did bad? Und als der Eibishter hat ihm der Fall gesagt, Divrei Mishpat, and Hashem had therefore spoken to him words of judgment. Und gedenkt euch, was hat gelernt wegen the Avis. He remembers that he learned about the forefathers. As sie haben gehabt viel Zorres, although they had many troubles. Haben sie von deswegen nicht gehabt kein Teines zum Eibishter Chulu, yet they had not had any complaints to Hashem. Legt sich bei ihm bepashtus, so the child, it makes sense to him simply as der Eibishter hat sicher gesagt Moshe, that Hashem certainly had said to Moshe, dem Teuchen von the idea that is expressed in the words of von Chaval al da'avdim v'lo mishtakim chulu. I woe those who are lost, and we can't forget them because they did not behave like Moshe Rabbeinu. They never questioned Hashem. Ba'adrab. Not only does it make sense to the child that there must have been some sort of a conversation in that aspect, even if the pasuk doesn't say it, he knows that that must have taken place. But Moshe nicht gesagt, had Hashem not said it to Moshe, this would have awoken, aroused by the 5-year-old to learn Chumash a very big surprise. How come as the Eibishter Zolas Nitzamen? If Hashem didn't say it, how come he wouldn't say it? So this idea that is presented by the second pshat is something that needs to be said. That makes sense in of itself. And therefore, no, then Rashi is mevayer. After Rashi explains Vazoy der Pirush for Rabbi Seinu, how the interpretation of our rabbis is nit misyashiv achara mikra, does not settle by the pasuk. Pshat ha-mikra darf geteicht werden wie der erste Pirush, and the simple meaning of the pasuk needs to be translated as in the first interpretation. Bleibt noch schwer. It still remains difficult. Bald as der inyan is machriach euch loit pshutei mikros. This idea presented by the second pshat, while it doesn't fit in the words of the Chumash, but it's still, the subject matter is forced. We have to say that, even according to the simple meaning of the Pesukim. As the Eibishter hat gesagt, or the Divrei Mishpat, that Hashem spoke these words of judgment, Chabal al da'av nechulu. Pavoshte is nit in Pasuk. So how come they don't stand in the Pasuk? So we would have a problem. Now, it doesn't mean that every dibur says in the pasuk, but this is something important. Let it be true as nit alle dibur Hashem al Moshe, not all of Hashem's words to Moshe zayin mefurish umefurut in their Torah that are articulated and detailed in the Torah shebiksav, in the written Torah. But does der pasuk here? The pasuk says by daber elikim el Moshe. Hashem speaks to Moshe dibur te mishpat, speaks to him with judgment. Und dazu geht über der Pasuk Kamo in Yonim und Protim. And the Pasuk adds many details, many matters and details. Was der Eibishter hat damals gesagt zu Moshe, which Hashem told at the time to Moshe, so now there's something Hashem just told him, Dibur Elikim Moshe, and he's telling him other aspects. In Parsha Shmois and further, also in this section of Shmois, Werder zählt, over there it's related, as if Amiras Moshe lo mare oisa, had the Eibishter geantwortet, that when Moshe Rabbeinu said, why did you do bad? Hashem answered him, Atosira, you will say, Goimer, was dos is an inya for Divrei Mishpat, also, this is also words of judgment. Rashi is not mefarish. Rashi says, you'll see not in the future, so Hashem was sort of saying it, in words of Mishpat, is farvozol der Pasuk nit. How could the Pasuk will not iber geben euch the divrei Mishpat? Why would the Pasuk not also present these words of judgment? Chabal al da'aftin. It's a shame those who are lost, the office school, etc. Ubefrata das is ataina chi chazoka. This is a very strong argument. Also according to the simple meaning. The Faris Rashi mamshich. The Faris Rashi continues. Therefore I say, Yisyashiva mikro chulu. Let the pasuk be answered in the normal, in the pshat. V'adrosha tidorish. Let the drosha should be darshan. Bald as men give by gefinta hechrech and teuchen aksubim. Since we have a proof forced in the contents of these verses, unanon dait in loshen aksubim, and a indication in the language of the psukim. I'll call upon derech hadrush, at least derech hadrush, of the divrei mishpat chabal al da'abdin on the words of judgment chabal al da'abdin, as implied by the drash, is those gufa machriach. So that itself forces us as badrosha to dorish. The drasha needs to be darshan. The pshat from them sipur zocht. The simple meaning of the story tells us darshan in the psukim, that we should also expand the psukim beyond the pshat, because it is all fits into the whole ideas and the storyline, what's going on up here. Thus haste, which means mikra that zählt dort der Posik wegen zwei Deburim von Eberstein zu Moshe. According to the simple meaning of the Posik, the Torah relates to us two sayings that Hashem spoke, two speakings that Hashem spoke to Moshe. Aleph, number one, the Deburim v'shtein befeidish in Posik, those things that are clearly in the Posik. Leitim pashtus loshna mikra, according to the simple meaning of the Posik. And number two, base the divrei mishpat vel chazan merubes in the zelba verter, the words of judgment which are hinted in the same words, loiten derech hadrash, according to the style of drash. Yudalef, the bald as Rashi zogdo anayin oifen in pirush hamikra. Since Rashi tells us a new style how to explain the pasuk. Umatun is klar zu welchen chelik batoira der pirush shaych. Elsewhere, it's always clear to what section in the Torah that interpretation belongs. There is the pirushim al derech hapshat, the interpretations which are by the pshat, simple. Kol agodas hamiyashvos divrei hamikra, dover dibur lefanav, including agodas that answer the words of the psukim, everything in its way. Vazei zayin and atel from shutesh hamikra, which are a part also of the simple meaning. They are in this pshat, either literal pshat or even agodat by yesheves. On the Perushim al derech hadrash and the Perushim that are by way of expansion, in Medrash Agoda, they are in Medrash Agoda Chelek hadrash b'Torah. That's the part of Drush. Do ober is a pirish. Was arkive yatrei rachshe. You're riding it on two separate chariot, pulling in different ways. You have Agoda and they putting it all together. A pirish versus muchrach mitzat pshata mikra. A pirush which is forced because of the simple meaning. This thing, the Eibishter must have told him this dibur. But where is the place nitim shata mikra that in the Chelek hadrash boy, and the place is in the portion of the drash. Is nit misyasha v'achar mikra, because that does not settle by the pasuk. Muzde ribe Rashi bring a raya v'azai from the pirush mikra. Rashi needs to therefore bring an evidence that this is that style of explaining the pasuk. Shenemar alei dvorei ka'esh num Hashem ukepati shefetzet tzelem eschalik l'kama netzotzis. This whole pasuk and this idea was meant kinal sivches as der eish is mischalik l'kama netzotzis, that the fire splits into various sparks. The chiluk pashtus zu ischen dem oifen wie a sela wird zubreckelt of kama chilokim, the way a stone becomes crumbed up to many parts. And how fire divides into many sparks. When a rock is split into many particles, each part is separate than the other. In sein Groß, how big it is, in sein Zier, the shape, form, As Eiken, the funken was gain a rush from a fire, as opposed to those sparks that come from a fire. Zet me said in the tzutzes alle gleichen, you see all the sparks equal. Seien kamo, seien echel, whether it's quantity or quality-wise. Me zet nicht kein Unterschied von ein Funk und dem zweiten, you see no difference between one spark and the other. Das Einzige, was zählt say, is the only thing that separates them, is was jeder Nitzutz fliegt in an andere Richtung, that each spark flies in a different direction, and place. Der geht letzad Meirev, und der letzad Dorav Bechuru. This one goes to the west, and this one goes to the south. Al derech ze is der chiluk benegeya to divrei Torah. And similar to this is the difference as it relates to words of Torah. Es ist voran der Eufen, wie Rashi sagt in Parshas Vayishlach. There is the way, as Rashi says in the portion of Vayishlach, v'divrei Torah kipatish yifoitzit sela mischalkim l'kamotayim. That the words of Torah are just like the hammer breaking up the stone, dividing into many timing reasons. But das is wie divrei Torah werden is Chelek in verschiedene Fani Limud. That is how divrei Torah, the words of Torah, are divided in various different styles of learning. Und das is bedugma, that is similar the kipatish yifoitzit sela, like the hammer breaks up the stone. Was is nit nor ashinui in mokoim. It is not just a change in place. Nor oich ashinui in toichen. There is also a change in contents, v'tam, and reasoning. Ein pirush hot atam from pshat. One interpretation has the taste, the feel of pshat, simplicity. The zweite atam from drash has the taste, the feel of drash chub. With the zwei pirushim in Rashi dort, as the two interpretation in Rashi in Vayishlach, oy vayikra loy keil elokei Yisrael, that he called him keil elokei Yisrael. The erste pirush, as mit loy werd gemeint dem Mizbeach. Vayikra loy koro shem ha-Mizbeach, that he called the name of the Mizbeach, koro shem ha-Mizbeach al shem ha-Nes, but on the Nes, is an inyan from Pshat. Und der zweite Pirush, HaKadosh Baruch Hu koro le Yaakov keil, hat a tam von Drash, that has a taste of Drash, will come a time. Aber do be Parsha saying, but in our Parsha, sagt Rashi, anayin uftu, Rashi comes with a new novelty, benegeya zu koi dvorai, that these are my words. Ados is wie dis Chalkus von Eish lekamen netzoitzes. This is as the separation from fire to many sparks. Beide Pirushim haben dem selben Tam. Both of these interpretations have the same time, same taste, the same sense over here. It's a content and a hechrech, enforced by the way of pshat. Similar, like all sparks have the same quantity, the same quality. The chiluk is not in mokim. It's a different space. Ein pirush nitzutz from pshat gefindt sich in ein ort. One interpretation, the spark of pshat is in one place. In pashtus loshen aksuvim, which is in the simple meaning of the ksuvim. And der zweite pirush nitzutz von hadrosha, hadrosha tedorish, from the spark of the drosha, gefindt sich in a zweiten ort, in a different place in Medrash and Mikra, in the Medrash the Mikra. Yud Beis. From Kol Hanal Zetman B'Yeser says V'Yeserosh. From all the above, we see with more force, with more strength. The Gans Torah is a Torah Achas. The entire Torah is one Torah. Der Teuchen von Torah Achas, the idea that it's one Torah is nit nor as the Farshidene Fane Halimud, that the various different styles of learning, werden gesagt im selben Posuk or Maimer, are said in the same verse in the same saying, und noch mehr, sie werden nicht Tauschlehner von Zweiten. They are evolved one from the other. Ki Yudua, as known as the Fire Fanim Limud, the four styles of learning, Pardes, Pshat, Remesh, Drush, Sod, Zainen Keneged, the Fir Oilum Sabiyah, correspond to the four worlds of Atzilus, Bri, Tzira, Asiyah, which evolve one from the other. So the same thing, the different interpretation come from one another. Was der Far müssen alle Chelke HaTorah Masim sein. And that's why they must all parts of Torah fit one another because they come one from the other. Und nicht nur als alle Chalokim von Torah stellen zusammen ein Koima Shlema. Not that only that all parts of Torah put together one complete story. Al derech vi alle evrei ha'adam, similar to all limbs of the person. Whether it's Sayevari Gufe, where it's the limb of the body, und Sayevari Nafshi, whether it's the limb of the soul, stellen zusammen in ganzen Odom, they make up an entire person. So it's more than that. No noch mehr. Euch wie jeder Chelik von Teure ist in seinem bestimmten Ort. Also, as every portion of Torah is in its own special place, und der Limud zu dem Chelik in Torah is dafkele de klola ha-limud amasim lechelik zeh. And that style of learning fits exactly the way it is for this section of Torah. Each part of Torah has its rules of study. Is mitzad dem was es is a tale from Torah's Hashem, because it's a part of the Eibishter's Torah. Was is the Ka'esh, it's like fire, l'maylo mihischalkus, which is beyond dividing, with the pshitus from Eish, similar to the simplicity of fire, which is not shaped and formed. So when it's in essence and its truth, it remains ein zach mit korsa al chelke HaTorah. One item becomes one with the rest of the portion of the Torah. Biz, as an inyan, was his mukhrach im pshute shel mikra, that something which is forced out from the simple of the pasuk can reingestellt werden in Chelek Hadrash. It can be placed in the section of the drash, even though it's connected to and it's muchra from Pshat. Yud Gimel, der mit hat man euch ha'ira b'negeya zu pnimis ha'torah. This is also a lesson as it relates to the inner part of Torah, nishmosa deraisa, the soul of Torah. As Madar wissen that you need to know as is ein zach mit nigla the Torah, that this is really one thing with the revealed part of Torah, which is gufa deraisa, the body of Torah. Bizim and Zed become a mekoimus until we see, to the extent we see in many places. As ein ha'inyan benigla omer ela darsheni beprimis ha'Torah, that the idea in nigla the Torah tells us you have to expound me in the primis ha'Torah. Nigla the Torah gufa is machriach. Nigla the Torah itself forces out a pirush from nishmosi deraisa, an interpretation of the soul of Torah. Ubem especially klolos inyan and nigla the Torah. Generally, when we have the generalized theme in the Nigla Torah for the Ta'ara Hashem, describing Hashem, Raglov, his feet, Etzba, the finger, V'chulu, and then the same thing is the other verse. As you find many of the writings that Rizal, Pirush Uninyor Madar Chapshat, and interpretation and ideas which are according to the simple meaning. Und durch dem, was man wird lernen, alle Chelke HaTorah, and by studying all parts of the Torah, in an Eifel for Torah Achas, in a way that it's one Torah, that man God in Gichel Zoicha sein, so very soon will merit to Limud Tarasu Shel Mashiach, to studying the teaching of Mashiach, Sheilamed Torah's Kol Ha'ilon Kuloi, who will teach Torah to the entire nation. and very soon in our days, actually in our days. This is Mesichas Shabbos Parshas Vaeira and Shabbos Parshas Boi, B'chamisha Osir B'Shvat in Tovshin Mem Aleph.